Welcome into the Blackhawks Breakaway Podcast. It's brought to you by Toyota. Toyota has more all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive vehicles than any other brand. Find yours and shine on. With Charlie Roumeliotis, I am Pat Boyle. Joining us now, lead Blackhawks writer for Bleacher Nation and the author of the new book, The Future, Bedard and the Chicago Blackhawks New Era. He's also president of the Steve Larmer to the Hall of Fame and Retire 28 fan club. He's the one and only Tab Bamford. How you doing today, Tab?
Oh, I'm working out. How are you boys doing?
Doing great.
Yeah, doing fantastic. Thanks for joining us. We know you've been juggling a lot of extracurricular activities today, so thank you for carving out some time on the Blackhawks Breakaway Podcast.
Of course, when kids decide that they want to be athletes, thus is life.
Well, let's talk about a kid who's become quite an athlete, and we're getting ready for year 3 of the Bedard experience. You wrote a book that chronicled his rookie year. We'll get to that in just a bit, but just talk about the development you saw from year 1 to what we witnessed in year 2.
Yeah, I think when you look at the 2 years, a lot of people, I think, hyper-focus on what his individual numbers were. And we were sold that this generational player was going to come in and score 50 goals and be a 100-point guy. And you had the projections that said he was going to be Connor McDavid overnight. And I've joked with both of you that the only thing that Bedard has in common with Connor McDavid in their second year was they both played with Pat Maroon. The situations are very, very different. But I think when you look at what Bedard has done for those around him, Ryan Donato spent a fair amount of time with him this year and had a career year and got a career contract out of it. Maybe Connor Bedard should have had some consideration for the Hart Trophy for getting 54 points out of 𝗵𝗂 last year. So when you look at what he's done for those around him, it's very impressive. And I think that's kind of where you start getting into so go get somebody who's like a bona fide 40-goal scorer to play with Bedard so we can really see where things could go. But I think that his defensive game is better than a lot of people give him credit for. I just think that he's playing a much more conservative game than Patrick Kane did at the same age when he came into the league, because Patrick Kane had like all-world players surrounding him. He had Patrick Sharp or Jonathan Toews or Marian Hossa, skating with him, and they were all very defensively responsible players. And so when he decided to just go do what Patrick Kane did so well, he didn't have to worry about, something sneaking out the back door on him because of the guys that were there with him. I think Bedard is trying to figure out what he can and can't get away with at the NHL level still. But I think he's becoming a lot more comfortable. And when the skill around him improves, it'll be very, very fun to watch for Blackhawks fans.
Yeah, it felt like that stretch early in the year, Connor, I think, went 10 games without a goal. And that was kind of I remember he was on Hockey Night in Canada and he was like, I wasn't expecting this start to the season, like both the team and himself. And from there on, the Hawks tried different line combinations. And then at one point they did move him to the wing to try to free him up. Long term, I want to ask you, do you see Connor better suited at the center position or at wing? Because I keep flip-flopping. It seems like the Blackhawks see him as a center long term, and Connor himself sees himself as a center. But I don't know if I would hate the idea that if they did push him on the wing to kind of be that Patrick Kane type offensive driver and just kind of pair him with a more responsible center. What do you think?
So, I think if you want to move Bedard off of the center, which he's said is his preferred position, you have to show him that there's an option there that's going to elevate his game. And I think that's what makes Anton Freundel so intriguing, because he can play both, right? I think a lot of people look at the size of Bedard and Nazar being fairly comparable, and they, maybe you don't have two guys that are 5'10" alternating at center, or have one 5'10" center with a 5'10" winger. I think Freundel is a big enough player physically already at 18 years old that if the offense is there, you might be able to have that conversation. Because I think he probably profiles more as a top line player, where, maybe 𝗍𝗄𝗏 𝗟𝗶𝗹 looks more like maybe a second, third line center and Ryan Green probably in the same category. So it'll be very interesting to see with the collection of center. I mean, 2/3 of the guys they've drafted under Kyle Davidson have played center in some way, shape, or form. I'm sure last year during training camp, if you asked most Blackhawks fans, they would have told you 𝗵𝗄𝘃 𝗏𝗟𝗃 was going to be the top line center on opening night. So I think if you're going to move Bedard off of the middle, you have to have a good reason to. And that's kind of, with so many issues with where they're at in the rebuild right now, you need to see somebody take it and go with it before you can really start speaking in definitives. And the kids making the decisions for us makes it hard for us to project a lot of things like that.
Yeah, and look, there's other things you look at too, as far as face-off win percentage. That's got to improve. Defensive habits. You know, Patrick Kane did an interview this week. He talked about in year 4, the Hawks had him at center, but Marian 𝗻𝗁 was on his wing doing all the center-like responsibility. So, you know, it also depends on, like you said before, who they have out there with him.
I mean, yeah, I think Marian 𝗻𝗁 would make a lot of people look a heck of a lot better at center. And I think you talk to Jonathan Toews and they'll tell you that, you know, he was probably a better center, probably had a full percentage point on his face-off rate just because Marian 𝗻𝗁 would win those 50-50 pucks off the draw. So a lot of, and I think that's where Kyle Davidson, his volume approach in the draft gives them the flexibility to allow these young players to sort themselves out. Like, you don't only have 2 center options, so you're stuck with it. You've got like 7 guys that could theoretically play center. We didn't even mention Oliver Moore. So you've got like 6 or 7 guys who could play center. Let the cream rise to the top and then sort out where everybody else falls in the lineup when they get there. So the good news is that there's volume. The good news is that there's options and that they're developing at different levels. The rock and the hard place continues to be, when will it all be here?
So Connor Bedard declined respectfully to go to the Worlds this summer because he wanted to radically change his offseason program. It sounds like he wants to get faster. He's really committed to doing so. And we've even seen on social media some of the clips of him working out with Macklin Celebrini and Kent Johnson in Vancouver. And he looks pretty good. Thoughts on the change, the maturity that he showed, not just kind of staying with his, you know, I'm going to stick with what has got me there, like already showing the willingness to want to radically change his offseason program, and the maturity to say, I'm going to not go to play for Team Canada this year because I want to be at my best for the Chicago Blackhawks come training camp. Thoughts on him doing that and how that might benefit him going into year 3?
Yeah, I think that, you know, all 3 of us have seen this and we've talked about it. The maturity that he's shown from day one is well beyond his years. And we've heard Ryan Donato talk about Connor Bedard, asking him what he changed to be a better skater this year and how that affected his game and what some of the things were that Donato did to make himself a better offensive player, and that he was going to incorporate that. And so I love that element. But I think the part that a lot of people sleep on when we talk about Bedard's maturity is how much was talked about Bedard not being on Canada's roster for the Four Nations face-off, and that he opted to decline an invitation from Hockey Canada to go to the Worlds. You know, this is a kid that I if you asked him in a sober moment, he would absolutely tell you that he wants to be in Italy for the Olympics next season, no questions asked. And the fact that he didn't, you know, wasn't on that Four Nations face-off tournament roster for Canada makes you wonder a little bit, like, is he there yet? And obviously when you've got guys like Sidney Crosby playing in the last Olympics, that kind of changes the dynamics a little when he's still as good as he is, pushing near 40. But I think it shows so much maturity from him to not only take that step to work on his game and ask the questions of guys that have shown that improvement, but also with the disappointment of not getting an invite from Hockey Canada just months earlier, to take the step to decline one and work on his game instead shows not only his commitment to the NHL, but just the perspective that he has at such a young age to see what he needs to do to be the best version Connor Bedard at the next level.
Tab, one thing too, you talked about the maturity of Connor, and it sounds like, he's open to hearing from other players like a Ryan Donato and veterans on his team and on other teams of what they did in the offseason to improve their game. You look at, what it sounds like it's a collaborative effort with the Blackhawks as well, with the reports coming out that they're on the same page, that they've discussed the training and the regimen that he's going through and the steps that he's taking. It's going to be cool when he comes to training camp for him, hopefully, to divulge, some of the behind the scenes stuff that went into this change. I saw a picture today on social media. He always had quads that, reminded me of Rod Brindamore back in the day. He's quadzilla even more. Like if this dude was looking for that burst of that jump on the ice in his first 3 or 4 strides, it looks like he's going to get plenty of that from those quads.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's got a couple bar stools for legs. It's kind of wild. But you're right. And I think that's where, I from hearing what Donato worked on, I think there's also a nuance to the skating technique where there's the straight line speed and acceleration, but then there's also the agility at speed. And I think that's what really separates guys like McKinnon and McDavid from everybody else is they're 2 strides to 75 miles an hour, but then they can weave through traffic. Like, you talk to John Weideman and he'll tell you that his entire perception of skating changed watching 𝗍𝗍𝗄𝗏 𝗏 cross over the opposite of everyone that's ever crossed over and things like that. And so I love that, but like watching the little snippets that you see from the different training companies and the different guys' social media, watching the way that he's working on not just the straight line speed, but also the agility in small spaces and the jump between defenders and hanging onto the puck through traffic. I think that's where, Patrick Kane was never Connor McDavid, but he could create space where there wasn't any, very Barry Sanders-like in that regard. And I think that there are elements to that Connor Bedard can learn. And it looks like those are some of the things that he's working on right now, which again, with his creativity that we've already seen as he gets more comfortable and knows what he can get away with, but also starts to get away with more. It's going to be fun to see how he develops. Again, doesn't turn 20 for what, like another week and a half?
Yes.
Like, he's still 19, kids.
One of the things I love doing after free agency is let's get an early opening night roster projection just to see where everyone could slot in. And it feels like this is pretty close to what the roster is going to be going into training camp. And then now it's just a matter of which young guys are going to stay with the big club and which young guys are going to start the year in Rockford. But with Connor Bedard specifically, who do you see as his line mates on the first game of the season? Feels like 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗍𝗏 𝗏𝗏 is going to be there at kind of manning one of the wings. And the other wing spot is probably going to be up for grabs, whether it's a Tyler Bertuzzi, an Andre Burakovsky, a Ryan Donato. Who would you predict early on for Connor Bedard's line mates?
I'm kind of leaning Burakovsky for a couple reasons. One, I like his skating. The fact that he told us that he feels like he's finally 100% healthy again. When we talked to 𝗻𝗓𝗄𝗏 last year when he was acquired, the question was, where did the scoring go? And if you go look at the audio or transcripts from our conversations when the Blackhawks acquired Burakovsky and 𝗍𝗓𝗏, they're almost identical. I had a year and a half going through some really tough physical stuff, and now I feel like I've got my legs back and I can go back to the game that got me paid the contract that the team that just traded me didn't want to pay anymore. But I love that Burakovsky, one, is a volume shooter, kind of like Ryan Donato in that regard, but he also shoots at a high rate. I think his career he's 14.5%, and he scored at about a 25 goal a season pace during the 4 seasons that he skated over 15 minutes a game. So a little bit more ice time, volume shooter who finishes at a high rate with a guy that can set up either one of them, like 𝗍𝗏𝗏 and Bedard, kind of running, full bore between the two of them. I think that could be a good mix. I could also see Ryan Donato up there. Donato started there, I think, last year. Didn't work immediately, and then he got back there, and it worked at times. So I'm very interested to see what they do with Burakovsky and 𝗵𝗂𝗃, because 𝗵𝗂𝗃 had a great year offensively. He's a phenomenal defensive player, elite speed. He was so good with Jason Dickinson. I think we forget that because Dickinson missed as much time as he did because of injuries last year. Do they go back to 𝗵𝗂𝗃 with Dickinson? I kind of want to see 𝗵𝗂𝗃 and 𝗍𝒗 together on a line and just watch that breakneck speed that those two guys possess go to work together, because I think they both play a really good defensively responsible game. They're both heat-seeking missiles going after the puck, but that whole 95th percentile of breakaway speed that they both possess could create some headaches for other people. So that top six, I think you've got some guys that have some offensive upside, and it's going to be really, really interesting to see how the new coaching staff puts everybody together, because the only guy that I struggle to figure out where he fits in the lineup is Tyler Bertuzzi because of the speed factor.
Okay, so on Bleacher Nation, you put out kind of your thoughts on what the lines may look like, and you had Burakovsky with Bedard and 𝗍𝗶𝗃. And then this was a little head scratcher to me, but I know you love the speed. We just haven't seen consistent play. You had Lukas Reichel as the winger with 𝗍𝒗 and 𝗵𝗂𝗃. You're bullish on Reichel.
I have not been bullish on Reichel. If you read a lot of what I've written over the last year or so,
having him on the second line, you are.
Yeah,
you changed the tune a bit.
This is where I think it's if you're a disco fan, his walkout song would be "Last Dance" this year, because I think Reichel stands have long held. Put him with guys who can skate, put him with guys who can produce offense, and see what he can do. And I understand that, and I appreciate that. And that kid skating with Craig Smith and Pat Maroon felt criminal at times last year, because he would get in the offensive zone and file his taxes for 2027, waiting for the big rig to show up. You've got an opportunity now with 𝗍𝒗 and 𝗵𝗂𝗃 to match his elite speed. So here's your chance. Go get it. Because I'm not really a huge fan of Reichel on the third line in a checking role. I think you've got some guys like Landon Slaggert, Ryan Donato, again, 𝗵𝗂𝗃, possibly Burakovsky, that play a little bit more of a physical game that makes sense there with Jason Dickinson. And I hate burying him on the fourth line again, even though that the speed will be better. You're still going to be looking at Nick Foligno down there. And when you look at, again, I think my biggest struggle looking at the roster as it's constructed right now is, where does Tyler Bertuzzi fit? And just like I said about Reichel with the big rig last year, if you put Bertuzzi out there with 𝗍𝒗 and 𝗵𝗂𝗃, they might have to wait 3 days for him to show up. Like USPS is still trying to find the package kind of a thing. So,
I was just going to say, hopefully Bertuzzi comes to camp in good shape, because he's traditionally been a slow starter. It was the same last year here in Chicago, and you begin to wonder, we talked about Bedard changing his off-season habits. It goes for veterans that are making $5.5 million as well.
Absolutely, and he's got 3 years left. So, I mean, that was the longest contract that Kyle Davidson had given to anyone before from outside of the organization. It still is, actually, because Donato was here already. So it's I'm going to be very, very interested to see what Bertuzzi looks like coming into camp, because Connor Bedard was very self-aware in his exit conversations with the media. Like, these kids can fly. Like, Oliver Moore was an eye-opener. Frank 𝗍𝒗 was an eye-opener. I've been a good skater at different levels. These kids are all elite, and I need to elevate my game. And you're right. Like, Tyler Bertuzzi needs to, have a sit-down 𝗏𝗏𝗃 about, like, I have to be faster, because I'm going to have better offensive skill around me potentially this year. But if I want more than, being a net front guy in the first power play and 12 minutes a night, I have to be faster, because everybody's going to run laps around me on this roster.
Yeah, I have a hard time. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Lukas Reichel got traded before training camp started, because it feels like it's a buy low candidate for a potential contending team to find. Like, for example, I think a team like Edmonton, I wonder about him going there because Stan Bowman is the guy that drafted him in the first round, but they're also looking for young, cheap pieces to plug into their top nine. And I just think they've given Reichel so many opportunities to seize control of a top 6 role, even a top 9 role, and he's failed to grab it. And so I don't know if you want to go into training camp wanting to allocate one of those top 9 spots to Lukas Reichel, as opposed to just trying an opportunity to give one of the younger guys like, a Ryan Green or an Oliver Moore or whoever the case might be to win that job right out of the gate. And I think you probably agree. And so I'm assuming that this roster construction is with the assumption that Reichel will be on the roster.
Yeah, that was the as of today.
Yeah.
With who's still here. I agree with you. And one of the, I shook my head last night when I saw the trade that went down between Tampa and Edmonton, because the O'Reilly kid that they traded for Isaac Howard, I would have loved. I was a big fan of his going into the draft last year. He's a big forward. He played for the London Knights. He kind of plays in those dirty areas, but he can move a little bit. He would have been a guy that would have been like, yeah, you know what? O'Reilly for Reichel, great trade. Get it done. See you later. But again, I think the good thing is if Reichel shows anything at $1.2 million for 1 year, that's a very affordable lottery ticket that a lot of teams that are strapped who need speed. And there are a lot of teams that are going to look around. If you're in the Western Conference and Edmonton's won it 2 years in a row, you have to think that you got to be faster. Colorado isn't getting a lot slower. So, speed still plays, and it finds a way. Victor Stahlberg lasted in this league forever. And I mean, yeah, jokes about being Swedish because he couldn't finish just abound. But you're right. I think as of today, that's where I would put Lukas Reichel. I think too many people forget, like Colton Dach was playing fairly well when he got hurt last year. And it was a freak injury that wasn't something that you could predict. So I wouldn't have a problem with an Oliver Moore. Again, if I'm advocating for Lukas Reichel being on a Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari line, whatever you want to call it, think about Oliver Moore there, who's got a whole other level of giddy up. I think Colton Dach could play in there as well because he can move a little bit. And then you've got more of a power forward with two guys that are skating with speed. So the good news is there are options. You're right. I think as the trade market starts to percolate, the Blackhawks we haven't even talked about the depth on the blue line yet, and there's so many teams that need help on the back end. I would not be shocked at all if Kyle Davidson was getting an email a day asking about some of the young guys and what their availability might be, just because there's so many that seem like they're ready now. So I don't think the Blackhawks roster is absolutely set. But as of right now, if you want to showcase Reichel and maybe get something for him during the season, I would want to see if that speed can play with a couple other speed racers.
Tab, I think we had a first this week. The biggest story in hockey came from college hockey, where Connor Bedard's cousin, Gavin McKenna, announced that he will be attending Penn State. And this sent shockwaves throughout college hockey. Certainly in the Big Ten, it sounded like it was down to Michigan State and Penn State. He visited both schools last weekend. He's going to go to Happy Valley. And you wrote a blog on Bleacher Nation talking about, the age-old question of, we produce so much talent here in the state of Illinois, and there's so many great players that come out of this, and due in large part to those 3 cups in 6 years that kind of rejuvenated youth hockey here in the Chicagoland area and across Illinois. Why does Illinois still have a club hockey team and not a Division I hockey team?
Yeah, and let's not forget, too, I think part of that piece, too, was one of the other really great youth hockey areas that's producing a lot of players at the National Development Program. St. Louis is great, too. Matthew Tkachuk and Clayton Keller were both drafted together a few years back, and they both grew up in St. Louis and went on to really good things with the development program. I would love to see Illinois revisit the idea of making the jump to D1. They would need to build a new rink, or at minimum spend a bunch of money to fix what they have already, and that's not a cheap proposition. So I get that. I also appreciate that, with depending on who you read, this massive amount of money going to Gavin McKenna to go to Penn State, that NIL changes the calculus a little bit here. And with Title IX, Illinois would need to do something to balance the books between men's and women's sports. To me, very easy solve. Also bring in women's hockey, because the Big Ten is terrific there as well. And I shouldn't have to talk about how many great women's hockey players have come from this state. Cammie Granato is a Hall of Famer for a reason, but Kendall Coyne, she's still winning championships. And so bringing men's and women's hockey together. But what changes a little bit, and this is a conversation that kind of feels like it gets revisited every couple of years, the NHL and the Players Association paid a lot of money for a feasibility study before COVID. They told them it was a no-brainer and that they should do it. Illinois sounded like they were good to go, and then COVID hit, pause button, and then no-go a couple years later. I think 2022 is when Josh Whitman said, we're not going to pursue it anymore. I think the difference now for me, and McKenna being the largest name in that field, is with the NCAA allowing Canadian Hockey League players from the various junior leagues to come into hockey now. Gavin McKenna is the biggest name, but he is far from the only name that is making the jump, either as a projected first-round pick or a recent first-round pick from one of the leagues in the CHL to the college ranks. And I think that the path forward for hockey to be a revenue sport, that's all anybody's going to care about. They can find donors to give the kids money, but is it going to make any money for the school? And I think that the path towards hockey being a revenue sport is a lot more visible now, because you've got so many elite players coming from the CHL. And especially in the Big Ten, where you have the Big Ten network, and it isn't like the NCHC that has a streaming service, and Hockey East has more of a regional deal for their television and some streaming. With the Big Ten network, with the Big Ten being coast to coast, you could theoretically be watching Michigan play Michigan State in LA or Portland, Oregon, or Miami, Florida at this point. So I think that the biggest reason for me is now I think the path to being a revenue sport is more visible, and it shouldn't be as hard to get talent to show up at Illinois, because they're perfectly between Chicago and St. Louis. They should be able to get talent.
One quick thing. I agree with everything you said. The other thing I'd like, if we're realigning things and changing rules, and I would love to see the NHL change the age of draft eligibility to 19. And I think we would see more players go to college. It would boost up the collegiate ranks. There'd be less misses as far as first round and second round picks, because you'd be drafting more developed players. Their bodies, I find it crazy that we're looking at 17-year-olds trying to forecast, how they're going to be at age 21 or 22 when they make their NHL debuts. I think one of the things that the other leagues benefit from is you watch a college player on the gridiron on Saturday, and then he shows his wares, plays incredible, and gets the opportunity to play in the National Football League, and you see him on Sundays right away. The Bedards, the McDavids, they're the anomalies. You don't usually jump from juniors to. So I would love to see that, with this agreement between the CHL and the NCAA, and with, I think this Big Ten, the Big Ten network should ride the Gavin McKenna train. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot of Penn State games, if not all of them, on television in some way or shape or form. But I would love to see them push that draft eligible age to 19 and bridge the gap between, in this case, college hockey and when we see them in the NHL.
Yeah, I buy that absolutely, because the other thing too is, and you see this with basketball a lot too, you've got kids that are reclassifying and going to college early. And I think you could make a really easy case that going to college a year earlier than he maybe needed to hurt James Hagan's draft stock. He was the consensus number one until Christmas, and then he's a point per game guy. He's not doing ridiculous things like Adam Fantilli did at Michigan right out of the gate. And so people start to, soften on the kid's prospects. And then it was almost like you had this, let's recreate a market for James Hagan's leading into the draft, when I don't think the skill ever disappeared. You were just jaded because he didn't put up enormous points as a 17-year-old playing against, in some cases, 22, 23-year-old men. So I'm totally with you on that. If you push the draft age back to 19, you can also have kids play all the way through their age 18 season in the USHL or the Canadian Hockey Leagues, which gives them an additional year of making money from kids that they're not paying, and then they can go have a full freshman year in college. I would totally buy that. That's a great idea.
All right, Tab, let's get to your book. I honestly feel like we can go all day with you talking about this. It officially came out in February. You were kind enough to give all the media members an advanced copy, and we appreciate all the behind the scenes that you provided us. So you were working on this book during Connor Bedard's rookie season while still writing for Bleacher Nation and covering the Blackhawks on a day-to-day basis. Can you walk us through that process of trying to decipher which information to hold for my book and which information to want to get out there for the fans so they could immediately read for your blog?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's tough, right? Because especially when he was a rookie, there was what did Connor Bedard have for lunch? Here's his Chipotle order, more at 4. Even though he's never had Chipotle, so that's a terrible example. No, I think, what was fascinating working on the book while writing every day was there were little things that I think I included in the book, like in interacting with fans before and after practice, and some of the little things that he did off the ice, and really more, maybe glimpses into his personality that maybe not everybody was like jumping through hoops to read about during the season, because we were so hyper focused on, like, we see him on TV, we want to see the goals, we want the highlights. Everything was about the highlights and the numbers. And the little things that went on behind the scenes. Again, we talked earlier about the maturity that he's shown since he got here. And I think a lot of the off-ice things that we saw and talked to him about, talked to other players about, experienced, heard from players on other teams about, a lot of that stuff, I think, was maybe not something that people wanted to read on a daily basis, but watching that evolve and grow, and his comfort level evolve and grow, it was an interesting thing from a book perspective, and maybe not a day-to-day perspective. And then looking at the way that just life flows as an 18-year-old, and the larger narratives going from the start of training camp to leaving to go to the Worlds last year, had a little bit more flow in book form than, writing about it on a day-to-day basis.
And I'm sure, like myself, this is one of the first times where you're interviewing a player that's roughly the same age as your kids. So you find yourself in more dad mode and like thinking about it from, if this was my kid, and and instead of maybe 15, 20 years ago where you were closer in age to the player you were talking to, and you were saying you could relate to what they were going through more then. Were there any tidbits, stories that came out, things that piqued your interest that you can tease, that you tell us in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, I think, throughout the year, there were frustrating moments for him with the broken jaw. That was probably as frustrating as anything that he's been through in his life. There were ups and downs with production. There were the team struggles, losing a lot of hockey games. Just the way that he always understood and appreciated kind of his station in the game, and saw himself as being a potential role model, a guy that kids could look up to, and always, like, if there was one kid in the stands for a practice, I think there was one where we stood around in the room waiting for him for like 20 minutes after a practice once in March. There was one kid in the stands, and he was talking to the one kid in the stands, taking selfies and flipping him a puck. And so just that, like, he's 18 and he's talking to a kid who might be 12, 13, 14 years old. And he appreciates that there's a potential role model, element that he is stepping into as the face of the Chicago Blackhawks. And seeing that, and you're right, like, my oldest son is 18 years old. He's like 15 months younger than Connor Bedard. I told him in September, this is your draft year. What are you doing with your life? And he played golf in high school. Too bad, so sad for me. It's just, I think, the way that he conducted himself from the start of the year with every camera and every bright light imaginable to the end of the year, which was kind of a dull thud because of how bad the Blackhawks were in the standings, and the fact that he never really seemed to miss a beat with that understanding that kids are going to look up to him, kids are going to idolize him, and he needs to hold himself in that regard. And I've said to people, if you had Jonathan Toews from the neck up and Patrick Kane from the neck down, that might be what Connor Bedard felt like as a rookie, but as 23-year-olds, not as the 18, 19-year-olds they were when they got into the league. Just because of the maturity that was there from start to finish, going through all the highs and lows, but never seeming to want to back away from an autograph request or a selfie op, was really, really impressive.
So, 𝗏, a lot of your book obviously is centered around Connor Bedard. He's the cover boy, but it also is kind of looking ahead to the new Blackhawks era that you have outlined. What are your general thoughts on the rebuild, the current state of it, and kind of where this rebuild is heading over the next couple of years?
Sorry, little cough there. I think when you look at how rebuilds fail, unfortunately, in professional sports, especially in hockey, we have more examples of rebuilds failing miserably than we do of rebuilds fully turning into the greatest thing that ever happened. And you've got the dynasty Canadiens just because you drafted well for 3 years. A lot of people have talked about the Blackhawks being very, very quiet in free agency this year, and most of the response was, what the heck, they need to get better around Bedard. And I think last year's free agency group was really more Band-Aids to wait for the kids to be ready and hold places warm so that they could appropriately develop. And one of the issues that always seemed to crop up when Stan Bowman was the GM was either young guys were brought up too early, or if they stayed in Rockford too long, they went from prospects to suspects, or they got traded before they could show what they could do in the NHL, like Philip Deneau. And I appreciate that they are very intentionally being conservative with the development of each and every prospect. Last year, I think there was all the pressure in the world for them to just tell Luke Richardson, Frank Nazar is your number 2 center. Let him look like crap for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month and a half. He needs to figure it out, but he's part of the future. They allowed him to go to Rockford, get out of the bright lights, get comfortable playing against professionals. And when he came up, he was really ready. And it showed. And he was a star for a couple months there. And then he went, and his confidence is probably through the roof right now after the way that he played in the World Championships. So this year, I think you're going to see the first waves of Kyle Davidson's rebuild strategy pay fruit in the National Hockey League. How many? TBD, because I still think they're going to be conservative. So guys like Ryan Green and Oliver Moore, and frankly, even still Kevin Korchinski and Artem Levshunov should be afforded as much time as they need in Rockford to be fully ready so that you don't have a development curve that flatlines too prematurely. But you're going to start seeing wave after wave after wave of young guy come up. And so I think now it's kind of it's nerve-wracking, I think, if you're Kyle Davidson, because now proof of concept is going to start showing itself at the NHL level. But certainly, I think we all agree the early returns from guys like Nazar and Landon Slaggert, and certainly the little glimpse that we got of Sam Rinzel at the end of last year should give you nothing but optimism for where this is going, because Sam Rinzel was a lottery ticket that a lot of people trashed that trade. Like, why would you trade up for a guy you could have had 20 spots later and take Peter Mrazek's contract? And then Mrazek is a serviceable, great stopgap goalie who does his job, who's a great pro, everybody loves in the room. And you might have gotten a top pair defenseman and identified that's, coal that turned into a diamond in 2 years at Minnesota. So if the early indications are anything, and they've consistently scouted the way that they've scouted, and we heard that after the draft, traits, the word traits came up about 1,000 times. If they keep drafting those traits and allowing these kids enough time to really properly develop, it could be pretty exciting sooner than later, because they've drafted like 700 guys in the last 4 years.
Well,
so they'll certainly have options.
You bring up Rinzel. That 22 draft is a great case study for how quickly a player can develop or not develop. If you redrafted, if the Blackhawks redrafted those 3 players that they took in the 2022 draft, they'd probably go in the inverse order that they were taken. It would probably go Rinzel, Nazar, 𝗵𝗁𝗏 versus the way it went down.
Absolutely. And I think that's what fascinates me about the CHL NCAA route the most, is I really think if Kevin 𝗵𝗁𝗏 had the option to play against older players, play fewer games, have the professional weight room, diet, all of that, play fewer games against tougher competition, and then go pro and be able to play in the AHL at 19. Right. Instead of there was nothing left for Kevin 𝗵𝗁𝗏 to prove at the WHL level, except go and dominate the World Juniors, and then you just run the risk of what happened to 𝗵𝗏𝗀, with the wrist injury, and you don't want to see that. But there comes a point in time where you're too good for the level that you're at. So where are you going to go? And there's word that like Michael 𝗵liche, his brother, is at Penn State already. If he doesn't make the Sharks out of camp and he hasn't signed his entry-level contract yet, could he join McKenna in Happy Valley? Porter Martone is allegedly flirting with Michigan State. And so now you have an option where if you don't sign your entry-level contract, can you go and jump into the college ranks and have a year playing against older, more physical competition? But for me, it's the physical development that you would get at the college level, with the professional weight room, the diet staff, all of the things that you get from a college athletic department. And then I'm not taking anything away from what they do in the different Canadian hockey leagues, but the way that they invest in student athletes at the college level, there's so many benefits in being able to jump from that to the AHL at maybe 19. I feel like that would have been so much more advantageous for Kevin 𝗵𝗁𝗏 than being way too good for juniors and only having the option of the National Hockey League at that point. So you're right. They'd probably go back and do it over again. But at the same time, I'm still not sleeping on Kevin 𝗵𝗁𝗏's, future, because I still think there's a lot there. It just, again, I think I've said this a million times about poor Kevin 𝗵𝗁𝗏, because he got here first with Connor Bedard, right? And we watched his growing pains in real time. When Duncan Keith and Brent Seabrook showed up, they were older than 𝗵𝗁𝗏, and there were only about 3,000 people there to watch him in person, and there was no TV, and there wasn't an expectation that you're going to hold up the mantle of a dynasty franchise. They created the gold standard that we now consider the Chicago Blackhawks was reborn by Duncan Keith, Brent Seabrook, Jonathan Toews, Patrick Kane, Marion Hood, all those guys. And it was long gone, pretty much from the time Chris Chelios left, and probably years before that. I'm sure Chelios would tell you, probably once, Larmer, Roenick, and Belfour left, it was pretty much, a skeleton crew. So the standard to which we hold and expect the Chicago Blackhawks now was not there when Brent Seabrook and Duncan Keith arrived on the scene. And even when they acquired Patrick Sharp and some of the other young guys were showing up in the NHL. So it's a completely different situation for these young guys coming in. And so I still think that there's a there for 𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀. I do, but you're right. You go back to 22, and I think if you redrafted that entire class right now for everybody, yes, the sample size is fairly small still, but I think Roumeliotis and Nazar would probably go higher than they were originally drafted in a full league redraft also.
Very well said. Last one for you, Tab. What's a realistic timeline for the Hawks to be playoff contenders again? And I mean this like make the playoffs and then stay as playoff contenders. And so what do you think is a realistic path for them to get there? How many years?
I'm going to say they flirt with the playoffs in 2027. They're back in comfortably in 28. There's a ton of variables that go in there too. If the right trade presents itself, I think we've talked offline and I've written a fair amount about like, don't expect free agency to solve your problems anymore with the cap going up as much as it is. You're going to have to trade for guys that if Boston wants to rebuild, offer them the sun, moon, and the stars, but not any of your top 8 prospects for Pastrnak. In which you're not going to get him because you'd have to trade half of your top 8 prospects. But I think they have enough assets now that you can be interesting in the trade market. They've still got a lot of draft capital. But if we see an Oliver Moore come in and take off the way that Frank Nazar did, I think that changes the calculus. If Sam Roumeliotis comes in and sticks and makes an impact like some people, like Frank Seravalli said, he could be for the Blackhawks what Brock Faber was for the Minnesota Wild. If he does that, it changes the calculus because then Artem Levshinov, who a lot of people think is number 1 defenseman material, becomes maybe your second pair right shot defenseman. And then you're looking at, is it Wyatt Kaiser? Do you go more physical with an Ethan Del Mastro or a Nolan Allen? Then your top 4 on the blue line is finishing puberty, and they're a problem for the people that the Blackhawks are playing against. So the variables of the timelines for each of these individual players plays into that. How they use and assess what they have internally and turn that into trade chips possibly is another one. But I think in 27 they flirt with the playoffs, in 28 they're in, and then I think they're going to be in for a long time after that.
Tab Bamford, thank you so much for doing this. Keep up the great work at Bleacher Nation. And again, the book is 𝗵𝗆, Connor Bedard, and the Chicago Blackhawks New Era, available wherever you can find a book. Thanks, Tab. Appreciate it.
Thanks, boys. Good to see you.
Tab, thank you. There's nobody that does puns better than you. So we appreciate the amount of puns that you dropped on this podcast.
Well, I do my best. That kind of comes with 3 kids. You have to keep the cargo shorts handy if you got kids and
we accept all dad jokes. We love the dad jokes. And that's going to do it for the Blackhawks Breakaway Podcast. For Charlie, I'm Pat. We'll catch you next time.